You can come, just don't embarrass me." The words lingered in the air long after Alexander Hayes walked out of the room, as if they had weight, like they were meant to press down, not just pass through. Naomi Brooks didn't respond right away. She simply stood there beside her desk, fingers resting lightly on a stack of neatly organized files, her expression unreadable, her silence mistaken, as it always was, for compliance. Outside the glass walls of the executive floor, Manhattan stretched endlessly, steel and light reflecting ambition at every angle. But inside that office, the power dynamic was clear, defined, and rarely questioned. Alexander Hayes was the kind of billionaire people didn't just work for. They adjusted themselves around him, softened their voices, sharpened their appearances, and rehearsed every word twice before speaking. Naomi had done none of that. She had been there for 11 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. And in all that time, she had never tried to impress him. That, more than anything, was why he barely noticed her. To him, she was efficient, invisible, replaceable. The assistant who anticipated needs before they were spoken, who never overstepped, never lingered, never asked for more. And tonight, she would be the punchline to a joke he had already forgotten making. It had started earlier that afternoon, in the conference room that smelled faintly of leather and expensive coffee, where a group of investors had gathered around a polished table, their laughter echoing just a little too loudly. Someone had mentioned the Hayes Foundation Gala, the event of the season, invitation only, cameras everywhere, a parade of tailored suits and carefully curated elegance. "So who are you bringing this year, Alex?" one of them had asked, smirking slightly. "Or is it another last-minute cancellation?" Another voice chimed in, lighter but sharper underneath. "You should bring your assistant." "What's her name again?" "The quiet one." There had been a pause, just long enough to register the suggestion as ridiculous. Then Alexander leaned back in his chair, eyes flicking briefly toward the glass wall where Naomi stood outside, reviewing a schedule on her tablet. "Naomi," he said, almost absent-mindedly, as if recalling a detail that didn't matter. The room chuckled. "You wouldn't," someone added. And that was the moment. Not a decision, not even a plan, just a flicker of ego, sharpened by boredom. "Watch me," Alexander replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. And just like that, the invitation was set in motion, not as an honor, not as an opportunity, but as entertainment. 20 minutes later, he stepped out of the conference room, adjusting his cufflinks, already moving on to the next task in his mind. "Naomi," he called, not looking directly at her. She turned immediately, as she always did, attentive without being eager. "You'll come with me to the gala tonight." No explanation, no context, just a directive. Naomi blinked once, processing. "As your assistant?" she asked calmly. Alexander's gaze finally met hers, briefly, measuring. "As my date," he said, the word landing with a casual indifference that made it sound less like a role and more like a prop. "It's simple. Stay close. Smile when necessary. Don't say anything unless I ask you to." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "And try not to embarrass me." There it was again, that line, delivered like a boundary, like a warning, like something she was expected to fail at. Naomi held his gaze for a second longer than usual, something subtle shifting behind her eyes, something he didn't catch. "Of course," she said quietly. No hesitation, no protest, just agreement. To him, it confirmed exactly what he believed, that she knew her place. But as he turned away, already dismissing the interaction, Naomi's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the edge of her tablet, a small, controlled movement that no one noticed. Not the junior analyst whispering by the elevators, not the receptionist adjusting her lipstick in the reflection of a marble column, and certainly not Alexander Hayes, who had already forgotten the tone of his own voice. What he didn't see was the way Naomi exhaled slowly once he was gone, the way her shoulders relaxed, not in defeat, but in calculation. Because this wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her. It was just the first time they had done it so publicly. And somewhere between the quiet hum of the office and the distant echo of city traffic, something unspoken settled into place. Not anger, not even defiance, but intention. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that waits. By the time the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the glass towers, the Hayes Foundation Gala was already underway. cameras flashing at the entrance of a five-star hotel on Fifth Avenue, luxury cars pulling up in a steady stream, each arrival more curated than the last. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble, a stage set for power, for status, for quiet competitions disguised as conversation. Alexander Hayes arrived precisely at 8 p.m., alone. His tuxedo was flawless, his expression composed, his presence commanding as always. A few heads turned. A few whispers followed. "Where's your date?" someone asked with a knowing smile. Alexander glanced at his watch, then toward the entrance, a flicker of irritation crossing his features before it disappeared just as quickly. "She'll be here," he said, though his tone suggested it didn't matter either way. Another voice, softer but edged with amusement, leaned in. Guess she knew her place after all. Laughter, low and polite, rippled through the group. Alexander didn't join in, but he didn't correct them either. Because in his mind, the outcome was already decided. Naomi Brooks was not part of this world. She was a detail, a background presence, a convenient choice for a moment that required nothing more than compliance. And yet, as the grand doors at the far end of the ballroom remained closed, as the music swelled and conversations continued, there was a pause building, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the inhale before something shifts. Because what Alexander Hayes didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Naomi Brooks had never been out of place. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to step into the light. Naomi did not rush, and that was the first thing that set her apart from every other woman Alexander Hayes had ever brought into a room like that. Not that he realized it yet, not that anyone in that ballroom could have predicted it, because to them she was still the assistant who had probably panicked, probably backed out, probably chosen safety over spectacle, and yet across the city, in a quiet, softly lit suite high above Park Avenue, Naomi Brooks stood in front of a full-length mirror, her reflection framed by floor-to-ceiling glass and the slow shimmer of evening lights, her expression calm, almost detached, as if this moment had been waiting for her far longer than the invitation itself. Because for Naomi, this was not about proving something to Alexander. It was about allowing a truth to finally be seen, one she had never felt the need to announce, one she had carefully kept folded beneath routine and simplicity, like a secret that only mattered when revealed at the right time. And as she lifted her hand to adjust the fabric at her shoulder, the gown caught the light in a way that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway, every detail precise, every line intentional, a piece not chosen in haste but understood, respected, worn with the kind of ease that cannot be taught. And behind her, a woman in black stood quietly, watching with a small, knowing smile, not a stylist, not hired help, but someone who did not need to be introduced. "They will not recognize you at first," she said softly, her voice measured, certain. And Naomi met her gaze in the mirror. "That is the point," she replied, her tone even, not cold, not warm, just clear, because recognition was never her goal, not in the way people usually meant it. She had never needed validation from rooms like the one Alexander stood in now, never needed to prove she belonged, because belonging was not something she chased, it was something she chose when necessary. And tonight, she had chosen. Back at the gala, the energy had shifted slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough for those who paid close attention to notice the subtle change in rhythm, the way conversations paused half a second longer, the way a few heads turned instinctively toward the entrance before looking away again, as if sensing something without understanding it. Alexander stood near the center of the room, a glass of sparkling water untouched in his hand, his posture relaxed but his focus sharper than he cared to admit. He told himself he was waiting out of obligation, that he would give Naomi a few more minutes before dismissing the situation entirely. But there was something else beneath that, something quieter, less comfortable, a flicker of curiosity that did not belong in his carefully controlled world. Still no sign of her. The same investor from earlier asked, stepping closer, his tone light, but edged with expectation. Alexander exhaled slowly, his gaze flicking once more toward the doors. "She is not late," he said, though he had not checked the time again. "She is deciding." The man raised an eyebrow, amused. Deciding what? And for a brief moment, Alexander did not answer, because the truth was he did not know. And that unfamiliar gap in certainty unsettled him more than he would ever admit. Across the ballroom, a soft chime echoed, subtle but deliberate, and the grand doors at the far end began to open, not dramatically, not with spectacle, but with quiet precision, the kind that draws attention without asking for it. One by one, conversations slowed, voices softened, heads turned, and then, in the space between expectation and reality, Naomi Brooks stepped inside, not hurried, not hesitant, just present. The fabric of her gown moving with her like it had always belonged to her, like it understood the room before she even entered it. The light caught along the lines of the design, subtle at first, then undeniable, a reflection that did not sparkle for attention but held it once noticed, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to recalibrate, not because she demanded it, but because she did not need to. The difference was immediate, visible, undeniable. People who had been mid-sentence fell silent. Others straightened unconsciously, and somewhere near the center of the room, Alexander Hayes felt something shift in a way he could not immediately define. His eyes fixed on the figure approaching from across the marble floor, his mind searching for context, for explanation, for something that would make sense of what he was seeing, but nothing aligned, because the woman walking toward him was not the assistant he had dismissed just hours earlier, and yet she was, every step measured, every detail controlled, every assumption he had made unraveling in real time. And as Naomi drew closer, her gaze lifted, meeting his without hesitation, without apology, and in that single, steady look, something unspoken passed between them. Not confrontation, not yet, but recognition of a different kind, the kind that does not ask permission to exist. And for the first time that evening, Alexander Hayes did not have the advantage of knowing more than the person in front of him, because the truth had just entered the room, and it was not waiting to be explained. The distance between them was no more than 20 feet, but to Alexander Hayes, it felt like something far greater had just opened up, a gap not of space, but of certainty, the kind that quietly dismantles everything you thought you understood without raising its voice. And as Naomi Brooks continued walking toward him, the room seemed to adjust around her in ways that could not be rehearsed, subtle shifts in posture, in attention, in tone. People who moments ago had dismissed her existence now watched with a focus they could not explain, because recognition was beginning to take shape not from memory, but from instinct, the kind reserved for those who belonged in rooms like this without needing to prove it. And Alexander felt it before he understood it. A flicker of something unfamiliar tightening just beneath his composure as he set his glass down without realizing he had done so. His eyes fixed on her, searching for a flaw, a detail that would restore the balance he had assumed. But there was none, not in the way she carried herself, not in the way she moved, not in the quiet confidence that did not ask for validation. It simply existed. And when she finally stopped in front of him, the silence between them was not awkward, it was precise, like a moment waiting to be defined. "You are late," Alexander said, his voice even, controlled, but lacking the certainty it had carried earlier, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression composed. "No," she replied softly. "I arrived exactly when I meant to." The words were simple, but they landed differently now, not as compliance, not as explanation, but as something closer to ownership. And for the first time that evening, Alexander did not immediately respond, because the script he had written in his mind no longer applied. "You look," he began, then paused, the rest of the sentence dissolving before it could take shape, and Naomi allowed the silence to stretch just long enough before offering a small, polite smile. "Appropriate," she finished for him, and there was no edge in her tone, no challenge, just clarity, the kind that reveals more than it says. Around them, the quiet hum of conversation began to rise again, but it carried a different energy now, curiosity replacing dismissal, attention lingering where it had once passed over. And a woman standing nearby leaned toward her companion, whispering something under her breath, her eyes fixed on Naomi with a growing sense of recognition. "That dress," she murmured, not finishing the thought, because she did not need to. The design spoke for itself to those who knew what to look for, the craftsmanship, the structure, the way the fabric moved with intention rather than excess. It was not just expensive, it was understood, and that distinction mattered in rooms like this. Alexander followed the direction of their gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the details he had overlooked at first, the subtle signature woven into the seam, the precision of the silhouette, the quiet authority of something that did not need to announce its value because it had already been acknowledged by the right people, and a realization began to form, not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle the assumptions he had made. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his tone sharper now, not out of anger, but out of the need to re-establish control. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "I did not get it," she said, her voice steady. "I was invited to wear it." The distinction was deliberate, and it landed exactly where it needed to. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "By who?" he pressed, and for a moment, Naomi said nothing, her eyes flicking briefly past him toward the far end of the room where a small group had begun to gather, their attention unmistakably directed toward her. And then she looked back at him, her expression unchanged. "You will see," she replied, and just as the words settled, a voice carried across the ballroom, clear, confident, practiced in commanding attention without raising volume. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, the microphone catching the light as the room gradually quieted. "Before we continue with the evening, we would like to acknowledge a special guest." A pause, brief but intentional, the kind that builds anticipation rather than demands it. "Someone whose work has quietly shaped more than one of the moments you admire tonight." Alexander's attention shifted toward the stage, but his focus did not leave Naomi, not entirely, because something told him, without evidence, that whatever came next would involve her in a way he had not anticipated. "Please join me in welcoming Naomi Brooks." The name echoed through the room, familiar to him in a way that now felt incomplete, like a word he had only ever understood in one context. And as the applause began, hesitant at first, then growing as recognition spread through those who knew exactly who she was, Alexander felt the final piece of certainty slip out of place, because the woman standing beside him, the assistant he had invited as a joke, was now being acknowledged by a room full of people who clearly did not see her that way. And as Naomi took a single step forward, her gaze lifting toward the stage, she did not look back at him, not because she was avoiding him, but because for the first time, she did not need to wait for his direction. And in that moment, Alexander Hayes understood something he had never had to confront before. That control, once assumed, is not easily reclaimed when it was never truly yours. To begin with, applause spread across the ballroom in layers, not explosive, not overwhelming, but deliberate, the kind that builds as recognition travels from one table to another, from those who knew immediately to those who followed a second later. And Naomi Brooks did not rush to meet it. She did not react with surprise or gratitude in the way expected of someone being introduced for the first time. Instead, she moved with a quiet certainty, each step toward the stage measured, unhurried, as if she had already walked this path before, not in this room, not with these people, but in a way that made the moment feel familiar rather than overwhelming. And as she reached the base of the steps, the master of ceremonies extended a hand, smiling with a respect that was unmistakable. "It is an honor," he said softly, and Naomi inclined her head slightly, accepting the gesture without diminishing it, without elevating it, simply acknowledging it for what it was. And behind her, the room had shifted completely now. Conversations had stopped, not paused, stopped. Eyes followed her movement with a focus that no longer questioned her presence, but recalibrated around it. And near the center of the ballroom, Alexander Hayes remained still, his posture unchanged but his certainty gone, because every piece of information he had relied on to define Naomi Brooks had just been proven incomplete, insufficient, and he felt it not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable unraveling, the kind that forces you to reconsider not just what you see, but how you chose to see it in the first place, on the stage. Naomi turned to face the audience, the soft glow of the chandeliers catching along the lines of her gown, and for a moment, she said nothing, allowing the applause to settle on its own, allowing the room to reach for quiet rather than demanding it. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying easily without effort. "Thank you," she began, simple, direct, not performative. I was not expecting to be introduced tonight. A faint ripple of polite laughter moved through the room. But Naomi did not lean into it. She did not play to it. Instead, she continued, "But I suppose some moments are more effective when they are not announced in advance." Her gaze moved briefly across the crowd, not searching, not avoiding, simply observing, and then, just for a second, it settled on Alexander, not long enough to hold, but long enough to be intentional. And in that glance, there was no accusation, no triumph, just clarity, the kind that does not need to explain itself. Design, she continued, her voice steady, has always been about understanding space, not just physical space, but social space, emotional space, the places people assume they belong and the places they believe they do not. A subtle shift in the room, attention sharpening, not because of the words alone, but because of the way she carried them, with ownership, with experience. "For a long time," she said, "I found it more valuable to observe those spaces than to occupy them, because observation reveals what performance often hides, a pause, brief, intentional. And tonight, I was reminded how quickly assumptions can define a narrative before truth ever has the chance to enter the room." The words were still measured, still composed, but something beneath them had changed, not sharper, not louder, just more precise, like a line drawn exactly where it needed to be. And across the ballroom, a few glances shifted, a few expressions tightened, not in discomfort, but in recognition of something unspoken being quietly acknowledged. Alexander felt it most clearly, not because the words were directed at him, but because they did not need to be. The message existed regardless of intention, and that was what unsettled him, because for the first time in a long time, he was not controlling the narrative of the room. He was part of it, and not in the way he preferred. Naomi allowed the silence to settle once more before offering a small, composed smile. "Thank you for your attention," she concluded, and stepped back, not lingering, not waiting for further validation, because she did not need it. The applause returned, stronger now, more certain, and as she descended the steps, several guests moved subtly closer, not aggressively, not intrusively, but with a clear shift. In intention, conversations that had not existed minutes ago now forming around her, invitations implied in tone rather than words, and yet Naomi did not engage immediately. She moved through the space with the same calm control, acknowledging just enough, deferring just enough, until she reached the place where Alexander still stood, his gaze fixed on her, no longer searching for flaws, no longer trying to reconcile appearance with assumption, because that effort had already failed. And as she stopped in front of him once more, the balance between them had changed completely, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone else, but undeniably. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was no script left to follow, only truth to navigate. And finally, Alexander exhaled slowly, the first sign of something unguarded slipping through. "You should have told me," he said, his voice lower now, less certain, and Naomi regarded him quietly, her expression unchanged. "Would you have listened?" she asked, not challenging, not accusing, simply asking. And the question settled between them with a weight that did not require repetition, because the answer, unspoken, was already understood. Alexander did not answer her question, not because he could not, but because the truth sat too clearly in his mind to be reshaped into something more comfortable. And for a man who built his world on precision and control, that kind of silence was unfamiliar, almost disorienting. He shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that would have gone unnoticed in any other moment. But here, under the quiet attention of a room that had not fully returned to its previous rhythm, it carried more meaning than he intended. Naomi did not press him. She did not need to, because the absence of an answer had already said enough. And for a brief second, something almost like a smile touched her expression, not triumphant, not dismissive, just understanding, the kind that comes from recognizing a pattern finally revealing itself. "You are different tonight," Alexander said after a moment, the words coming out slower than usual, as if he were choosing them more carefully than he ever had before. Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering him. "No," she replied softly. "I am exactly the same." And that was the part that unsettled him the most, because if she had not changed, then everything that had. just shifted and his perception came from him, not her, and that realization did not sit comfortably around them. The room had begun to move again, conversations restarting, but not with the same dismissive ease as before. Now there was a current of awareness threading through it, glances that lingered, tones that adjusted, people recalibrating their positions in relation to Naomi, and as if on cue, the first of them approached, a man in his early 50s, impeccably dressed, his confidence tempered by a clear respect as he stepped into their space. "Ms. Brooks," he said, extending his hand. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you in person. I have followed your work for years." Naomi accepted the handshake with a calm ease, her posture unchanged. "Thank you," she replied, her tone polite but not overly accommodating, and Alexander watched closely, not the words, but the dynamic. The way the man adjusted his stance, the slight deference in his voice, the way the conversation positioned Naomi not as someone seeking approval, but as someone being acknowledged, and it happened again and again, another guest, then another, each interaction reinforcing the same quiet truth. Naomi Brooks was not being introduced to this world. She was already a part of it, just not in the way he had assumed. And as the circle around her grew, Alexander found himself standing just outside of it, not excluded, not intentionally, but repositioned, and for the first time in a very long time. He was not the center of attention in a room he had funded, shaped, and controlled, and the shift was subtle, but undeniable. "Alexander." A familiar voice cut through his thoughts, and he turned to see Claire stepping closer, her expression composed but her eyes sharper than usual. "You did not tell me," she said quietly, her tone neutral but carrying a layer of something else beneath it, not accusation, not exactly, but awareness. "Tell you what?" he replied, though he already knew the question was not as simple as it sounded. Claire's gaze flicked briefly toward Naomi, then back to him. "That your assistant was Naomi Brooks," she said, each word precise, and Alexander held her gaze for a moment. Before answering, "She did not tell me." The admission was quiet, almost too quiet, and Claire studied him for a second longer, as if recalibrating her understanding of him in real time. "Then you should probably start asking better questions," she said, not unkindly, but without softening the point, and with that, she stepped away, leaving him with a silence that felt heavier than before. Across the room, Naomi had shifted slightly, no longer surrounded, but engaged in a smaller conversation. With a woman whose name Alexander recognized immediately, one of the most influential figures in luxury design, their exchange calm, focused, grounded in mutual understanding rather than display. And as Alexander watched, he realized something else, something that did not fit neatly into the narrative he had constructed earlier. Naomi was not using this moment to elevate herself. She was simply existing within it, as if it had always been hers to occupy, and that difference mattered because it was not performance, it was presence, and slowly, almost without deciding to, Alexander began to move toward her, not with the same confidence he had carried at the beginning of the night, but with something more measured, more deliberate, as if each step required a recalibration of what he thought he understood. And when he reached her again, the conversation she was in paused naturally, not because he interrupted, but because his presence still carried weight, even if that weight now felt different to him. "Naomi," he said, her name sounding unfamiliar in his own voice, and she turned to him, her expression calm, attentive, but not deferential. "Yes," she replied, and for a moment, he searched for the right words, something that would restore the balance, something that would place him back in control of the interaction, but nothing came, because the truth was simpler than any strategy he could construct. "I underestimated you," he said finally, the words quiet but clear, and Naomi held his gaze for a second before responding. "Yes," she said, not harsh, not forgiving, just honest, and in that single word, there was no room for negotiation, no space for deflection, just acknowledgement. And as the noise of the ballroom continued around them, Alexander Hayes stood in a place he had never been before, not at the top, not in control, but in the presence of someone he had failed to see clearly until it was too late to pretend otherwise. The words settled between them with a finality that did not need emphasis. And for a moment Alexander did not try to respond, because there was nothing left to defend, no angle to reposition himself without denying what had already been made clear, and Naomi did not look away. She simply held his gaze long enough for the truth to exist fully, then let it pass, not dismissing him, not diminishing him, but refusing to stay in a moment that had already served its purpose. And as she turned slightly, acknowledging someone approaching from her left, the shift was immediate, subtle but absolute. The conversation moved forward without him at the center, and Alexander felt it not as rejection, but as displacement, the kind that comes when the structure you relied on no longer holds its shape. He stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but recalibrating, watching as Naomi engaged with another guest, her tone steady, her presence unchanged, no sign that she needed to prove anything further, because she had already done so without trying. And for the first time that evening, Alexander allowed himself to observe her without inserting his own assumptions into what he was seeing. The way she listened more than she spoke. The way her responses were precise, not excessive. The way people leaned in slightly when she spoke, not because she demanded attention, but because she understood how to hold it without force. And it was in that observation that something shifted again, quieter this time, less about shock and more about recognition, not of her status, but of his failure to notice it. Across the ballroom, the music softened into a gentle instrumental, conversations settling into a more intimate rhythm as guests moved between clusters of conversation and quiet negotiation, and near the far end, a small group gathered around a display featuring sketches and fabric samples, a curated presentation tied to the evening's theme of innovation and design. Naomi's gaze moved toward it almost instinctively, and without hesitation, she excused herself from the conversation she was in, stepping toward the display with the same calm certainty she had carried all night. Alexander followed a moment later, not out of obligation, not even out of curiosity in the traditional sense, but because something in him needed to understand, not the surface, but the depth of what he had missed. When he reached her, she was standing just to the side of the display, her attention focused on a series of sketches pinned in a clean, deliberate arrangement, each one detailed, intentional, unmistakably refined. "You recognize them," he said, more statement than question, and Naomi did not turn immediately, her eyes tracing the lines of one particular design before she answered. "I should," she said quietly. "I drew them." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that shifted the entire context of the moment. Alexander felt it immediately, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with pressure and everything to do with realization. "These are yours," he said, and this time it was a question, not because he doubted her, but because he needed to hear it confirmed. Naomi nodded slightly, finally turning to face him. "Some of them," she replied. "Not all." And there was no pride in her tone. No need to claim ownership beyond what was true, just clarity, and Alexander glanced back at the display, seeing it differently now, not as an abstract presentation of talent, but as a direct extension of the person standing beside him, the same person he had reduced to a role defined by convenience. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, his voice lower now, not demanding, not defensive, but searching. Naomi met his gaze evenly. "Because you never asked," she said, and the simplicity of the answer cut deeper than any accusation could have, because it removed any justification he might have constructed. It placed the responsibility exactly where it belonged, not on her for remaining quiet, but on him for choosing not to see beyond what was presented at the surface. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the room continuing around them, but fading into something distant, less relevant, because the conversation that mattered was no longer public. It was personal, not in intimacy, but in truth. And Alexander exhaled slowly, running a hand along his jaw as if grounding himself in a reality that had shifted too quickly to process comfortably. "I made a mistake," he said finally, the words measured, intentional, and Naomi watched him for a second before responding. "Yes," she said again, consistent, unwavering. And there was something in that consistency that forced him to remain honest, because she was not offering him a way out, not softening the edges of what had happened. She was simply acknowledging it as it was. And as the silence returned between them, it no longer felt like a gap to be filled, but a space to be understood. And somewhere within that space, the dynamic between them continued to change. not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the quiet, undeniable shift of truth settling into place. And for Alexander Hayes, that shift carried a realization he could not ignore, that respect, once assumed, is not maintained by position alone. It is earned by perception, by attention, by the willingness to see what exists beyond expectation. And tonight, he had failed to do that until it was too late to pretend otherwise. The silence between them lingered just long enough to change its meaning, no longer a gap filled with tension or misunderstanding, but something quieter, heavier, like a realization settling into place without needing to be spoken aloud. And Naomi did not rush to fill it. She simply turned her attention back to the sketches in front of her, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the display as if grounding herself in something familiar, something that existed long before this moment, long before Alexander Hayes had ever entered her world. And for him, that contrast was impossible to ignore, because everything about his life had always been built on visibility, on recognition, on the assumption that power was something you carried into a room and watched others adjust around. But Naomi did not adjust. She did not orbit his presence. She moved independently of it, and that difference forced him to confront something deeper than a simple mistake. It forced him to question the way he defined value in the first place. "Why work for me?" he asked after a moment. The question quieter now, stripped of authority, almost personal in a way that did not come naturally to him. Naomi paused, not surprised by the question, but thoughtful in her response, as if she had considered it long before he ever thought to ask. "Because I wanted to understand how power moves," she said, her voice calm, her gaze still on the sketches, not from the outside, but from within. She glanced at him then, briefly, her expression steady. "And you are very good at what you do." The acknowledgement was genuine, but it was not admiration, not in the way he was used to receiving it. It was observational, precise, and that made it more meaningful than flattery ever could. Alexander absorbed that, the compliment, landing differently because it was not given freely. It was earned through her perspective, not his expectation. "And now?" he asked, the question carrying more weight than he intended, because he was no longer asking about her role. He was asking about her choice. Naomi considered him for a second, then looked past him toward the center of the ballroom where the evening continued to unfold, conversations weaving together in patterns he suddenly felt outside of. "Now I have what I came for," she said simply, and there was no finality in her tone, no indication of departure, but there was clarity, the kind that does not leave room for assumption, and that unsettled him in a different way, because for the first time, he realized that her presence in his life had never been defined by necessity. It had been defined by intention, and intention can change. Across the room, a voice called Naomi's name again, more familiar this time, and she turned slightly, acknowledging the person with a small nod, then looked back at Alexander. "You should go," she said softly, not dismissing him, but redirecting him. "This is your event." He almost smiled at that, a brief, fleeting expression that did not fully form. "It does not feel like it anymore," he admitted, and that honesty, unexpected and unpolished, shifted something again, not in the room, but between them. Naomi studied him for a moment, as if reassessing, not his status, not his position, but something more fundamental, something closer to who he was when he was not performing control. "Then maybe you should decide what you want it to be," she replied. And the simplicity of the statement carried more challenge than any direct confrontation could have, because it placed the responsibility back in his hands without offering a solution. And for a moment, Alexander said nothing, because he understood what she meant, not just about the event, but about everything, the way he approached people, the way he defined relationships, the way he allowed assumptions to stand in for understanding. And that awareness did not come with immediate answers. It came with discomfort, with the quiet recognition that something needed to change, but he had not yet decided how. Naomi gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the moment for what it was, then turned away, stepping back into the flow of the evening without hesitation. And this time, Alexander did not follow immediately. He remained where he was, watching her move through the space with the same quiet certainty, the same presence that no longer needed to be revealed, because it had already been seen. And as he stood there, surrounded by a room that no longer felt entirely under his control. He realized something that had nothing to do with business or reputation, something that existed outside the structures he had spent his life building. That respect is not given because of who you are, it is given because of how you see others. And tonight, Naomi Brooks had seen him more clearly than he had ever seen her, and that imbalance was not something he could ignore anymore. Not if he wanted to move forward as anything more than the man who had made a joke he did not fully understand until it was too late to take it back. And for the first time since she walked into his office that morning, Alexander Hayes found himself in a position he had never planned for. Not in control, not certain, but aware, and that awareness, quiet and undeniable, was the beginning of something he could not yet define, but knew he could not walk away from without changing something fundamental within himself. Alexander did not move immediately after Naomi stepped away, not because he could not follow, but because something in him resisted the instinct to return to what was familiar, the rhythm of control, the predictable exchanges where he dictated tone and direction, and instead, he remained still, allowing the moment to stretch just a little longer, long enough for him to recognize that the discomfort he felt was not something to avoid, it was something to understand. And as the soft music continued to weave through the ballroom, he exhaled slowly and finally turned, not toward the center of attention, not toward the investors who had once defined the success of his evening, but toward the stage. Because for the first time that night, he realized the event was not about appearance, it was about intention, and he had lost sight of that somewhere between expectation and ego. The master of ceremonies glanced at him as he approached, a subtle shift in posture acknowledging his presence. But Alexander did not pause. He stepped onto the stage without announcement, without the usual introduction that would have preceded him in any other context, and the room responded almost instantly. Conversations fading, attention recalibrating, not because he demanded it, but because habit still recognized his position, and for a moment, he stood there in the soft glow of the chandeliers, looking out at the crowd that had always reflected his influence, but now felt slightly distant, as if he were seeing it from a perspective he had never allowed himself before. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady, but lacking the performative edge it usually carried. And that alone was enough to shift the tone of the room, because Alexander Hayes was not known for speaking without purpose, without control. "I was planning to give a different speech tonight," he continued, a faint pause marking the admission. Something polished, something expected. A few quiet smiles appeared in the audience, but he did not lean into them. He did not soften the moment with humor. Instead, he allowed the truth to stand on its own. But it would not have been honest. The words settled into the space with a weight that drew attention rather than applause. And for the first time that evening, people were not just listening to him. They were trying to understand him. Across the room, Naomi had stopped as well, her attention shifting back toward the stage, not surprised, not impressed, just present. And Alexander found her without searching, his gaze meeting hers briefly before returning to the audience. "Tonight," he said, "I was reminded of something I should have learned a long time ago." His voice remained even, but there was something beneath it now, not vulnerability in the way people often displayed it, but clarity. That perception is not the same as understanding, and assumptions are not the same as truth. The room was completely still now, not out of obligation, but because something real had replaced the performance they were used to witnessing. "I invited someone here tonight without taking the time to know who she really was," he continued, not naming Naomi directly, but not needing to, because every person in the room already understood. And in doing that, I reduced her to a role that was convenient for me, instead of recognizing the value she already carried. A shift moved through the audience, subtle, but present, not judgment, not yet, but awareness, the kind that quietly redefines how a moment is remembered. Alexander paused, just long enough to let the weight of his words settle, then continued. "That was my mistake. No hesitation, no deflection, just ownership." And that, more than anything else he had said that night, changed the way the room responded to him. Because power rarely admitted fault without attaching explanation to it, without protecting itself in some way. But he did not do that. He simply let the statement exist, complete and unguarded. "So tonight," he said, his tone steady, "is not just about celebrating innovation or success. It is about recognizing the people who create it, even when we failed to see them at first. And as he spoke, his gaze moved once more toward Naomi, not to draw attention to her, but to acknowledge her in a way that did not diminish her independence. Because real value does not announce itself, it does not need permission to exist. It is there, whether we choose to recognize it or not. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with a shift that could not be undone. Because once a truth is spoken in a room like this, it lingers, it reshapes perception in ways that no amount of control can fully reverse. And as Alexander stepped back from the microphone, he did not wait for applause. He did not measure the reaction. He simply descended the stage with the same calm certainty he had seen in Naomi earlier, not replicating it, but understanding it. And when he reached the floor again, the room did not return to its previous state. It moved forward differently. Conversations quieter, more intentional, glances more thoughtful, and across the space, Naomi watched him for a moment, her expression unchanged. But there was something new there, not approval, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement, the kind that recognizes effort without immediately rewarding it. And as their eyes met once more, the distance between them felt different, not smaller, not larger, but more honest, because for the first time that night, Alexander Hayes had stepped out of the role he had always controlled and into something far less certain, but far more real, in Naomi. Brooks, who had never needed the stage to define her, now saw him standing on it in a way that might finally allow him to understand what he had missed all along. The applause that followed his words did not come all at once. It built slowly, uneven at first, as if the room needed a moment to decide how to respond to something that was not polished, not calculated, but real. And then it grew, not louder than usual, but deeper, more deliberate, the kind of acknowledgement that does not celebrate perfection but recognizes honesty. And Alexander did not look toward the crowd to measure it. He did not search for approval or validation, because for the first time that evening, the reaction of the room was not the point. What mattered had already been said. And as he stepped fully back onto the floor, the distance between him and Naomi no longer felt like something to close quickly. It felt like something to approach with intention, and she remained where she was, not moving toward him, not turning away, simply allowing him the space to make that choice on his own. And when he did, when he finally walked toward her again, there was no urgency in his steps, no attempt to reclaim anything he had lost. Only a quiet determination to stand in front of her without the assumptions that had defined him before. That was not part of your plan, Naomi said softly as he reached her, her tone neutral, but carrying a subtle note of recognition, and Alexander almost smiled. A small, genuine expression that did not carry the weight of performance. No, he admitted. It was not. And for a moment, they stood there without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment itself did not require immediate words. It held its own meaning, its own shift, and Naomi studied him quietly, not evaluating, not testing, simply observing the difference, the absence of the sharp edge that had defined him earlier, the presence of something more grounded, more aware. You did not have to do that, she said after a second, and Alexander met her gaze, steady now in a way that felt different, less about control, more about clarity. Yes, he replied. I did. The certainty in his voice was not forceful. It was settled, like a decision that had already been made and did not need to be defended. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, acknowledging the effort without overstating it, because she understood something he was only beginning to realize, that change is not proven in a single moment. It is shown over time, and one speech, no matter how honest, does not erase what came before, but it can begin something new, and that beginning was what she recognized now. Nothing more, nothing less, around them. The ballroom had resumed its rhythm, but it had changed, subtly, permanently. Conversations carried a different tone, less performative, more intentional, as if the energy of the room had shifted from display to awareness, and in that shift, Naomi moved easily, engaging where she chose, stepping back where she did not, never pulled, never pushed, simply present in a way that did not need to be defined by anyone else. And Alexander watched her for a moment, not with the detached observation he had used before, but with a genuine attempt to understand, not her status, not her influence, But her perspective, "I would like to start over," he said. Finally, the words simple, direct, without embellishment, and Naomi raised an eyebrow slightly, not surprised, but curious. "Start over," she repeated, and he nodded. "Not as your employer," he clarified. "Not as someone who assumes he already knows the answer." A brief pause, just enough to let the meaning settle, but as someone willing to ask the question first. And this time, when Naomi looked at him, there was a faint shift in her expression, not agreement, not refusal, but consideration. The kind that does not come easily, because it is not given lightly. "And what would you ask?" she said, her voice calm, her gaze steady, and Alexander did not hesitate, not because the answer was easy, but because he had already understood what mattered most. "Who are you really?" he asked, and the question, simple as it was, carried a sincerity that had been missing from everything that came before. Naomi held his gaze, the silence stretching just long enough to make the moment feel intentional, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a small smile touched her expression, not the polite kind she had used earlier, not the controlled version reserved for public spaces, but something more genuine, more personal. "That," she said softly, "depends on whether you are ready to listen." And for the first time that night, Alexander Hayes did not try to respond immediately. He did not fill the space with certainty or assumption. He simply nodded, once, quietly, because he understood. Now that listening was not something you claimed, it was something you proved. And as the music shifted into something softer, something more reflective, the distance between them remained, not as a barrier, but as a space that would be crossed not through power or position, but through understanding, step by step, moment by moment. And in that space, something new began to take shape, not defined, not guaranteed, but real, grounded not in the roles they had played, but in the truth they were just beginning to discover about each other. And for both of them, that truth was no longer something to reveal, it was something to build.